Topics in Chapter 9, Volume 2, Part 1. Tilden's relations to the new president, Cleveland. Senator Garland a suitor. Letters to Manning. Tilden's and Jefferson's views of civil service. Harbor defenses. Letter to Carlisle. Tilden's friends proscribed at Washington. Letter to Watterson. George W. Julian. Tilden discourages his nephew and namesake from embarking in politics. B Minturn. Manning's illness and retirement from the treasury. History of the Monroe Doctrine. The Broadway Railroad. Advice to Governor Hill against the proposed enlargement of the Erie Canal. Favors the bill for an international park and for the protection of the Adirondack forests. Mr. Cleveland's election was generally and very naturally regarded as a continuation of the Tilden dynasty, and as a consequence his supposed influence with the new president was very extensively solicited by candidates for place under the new administration from all parts of the country. Among the earlier applications of this character was one from Senator Garland, of Arkansas, who desired the position of Attorney General. To him, Mr. Tilden sent a letter evidently intended not entirely to conceal his mistrust that whatever value Mr. Cleveland had professed to attach to his advice in the previous June, the election had seriously impaired. It would have been fortunate for Mr. Garland had he followed the advice which Mr. Tilden, with so much delicacy, tried to convey to him. He left a place where his manifold limitations escaped observation, for one in which they alone were conspicuous. Tilden to Garland. Confidential, Greystone, December 5, 1884. Dear Senator Garland. I have received your letter. I appreciate all the consideration which it so frankly suggests. Although I have had less personal acquaintance with you since 1868 than I could have wished, I have not been left without the means to form a just estimate of your acquirements as a lawyer, your rank as a senator, and your high personal character. I do not know to what extent, or in what cases, if any, I shall be consulted by Mr. Cleveland in respect to the constitution of his cabinet. I do not intend to intrude upon him any advice unasked, or to volunteer any recommendations or requests. If consulted, I shall not act as a partisan of any of my numerous friends who would like to enter his cabinet, but shall endeavor, with judicial impartiality, to canvass the personal merits and other considerations which ought to influence the choice. I am anxious that he should do the best thing possible for the country and for his administration, and shall desire rather to help him in his difficult task than to add to his embarrassments. The formation of a cabinet is a piece of mosaic in which each element may be affected by the size, texture, and color of the others entering into the combination, and it is impossible to foresee how much an individual element may be affected by the cast of the whole. Impressed as I am with your adaptation to the trust which you indicated as most agreeable to you, I should feel some regret at your leaving the Senate, both on account of the public interest and the personal distinction and growth which you would surrender. An intelligent and judicious friend, who reads all the reported debates, tells me that you appear to great advantage in the senatorial discussions. The role as the confidential representative of the administration in the Senate is greater than any cabinet office. I remember how Thomas H. Benton and Silas Wright felt on that subject. While occupying that relation, Mr. Wright grew to greater prominence than any other Democrat in the country. In 1844 he was nominated against his will for the vice presidency, and, I happen to know, was informally offered the presidential nomination before it was conferred on Mr. Polk. His transcendent hold upon the country carried the presidential election for the Democracy. If it should fall to the lot of Mr. Cleveland to fill several appointments in the Supreme Court, I hope that he will select men, not only of eminent legal capacities and of pure personal character, and of sounder constitutional ideas that have lately been found in that body, but have something more to give to the country than the dregs of life. Most of the great judges have been taken young, and their character formed on the bench. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Honorable A. H. Garland, Washington, D.C. In point of fact, Mr. Tilden was not consulted about his cabinet by President Cleveland until nearly or quite every place but one had been filled, when his advice about a Secretary of the Treasury was invited. He recommended Mr. Daniel Manning, of New York. Mr. Manning was reluctantly appointed to that position, but never welcome to it nor in it. Whether Mr. Cleveland underrated the value of Mr. Tilden's judgment, or overrated his own, it is quite certain that Mr. Manning did neither, for he appears to have rarely, if ever, taken any important step while he continued in the cabinet without trying to secure Mr. Tilden's approval of it. Some of Mr. Tilden's letters on public questions submitted to him for his views have not yet lost their value. On the 1st of March, and only 3 days before Manning was to take office, Mr. Tilden wrote to him. Tilden to Manning. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 1, 1885. Dear Mr. Manning, the first thing to be done in the Treasury is to ascertain how far the redemption fund, as it is called, which is the stock of gold kept in reserve to redeem the greenbacks, has been impaired. I suspect the deficiency is not less than 30 or 40 millions. The construction of the laws adopted by Mr. Sherman, late Secretary, by Mr. McCulloch, present Secretary, and by Mr. Wayman, Treasurer, there is express legal authority to make good, by sale of the United States bonds, such deficiency as may be found from time to time to assist in the redemption fund. Mr. McCulloch in his letter to me claimed the right to check out, in the discretion of the Secretary, from the existing mass of gold in the Treasury, if thereby a deficiency was created in the redemption fund, and then to make good that deficiency by the sale of bonds. If the government pay the interest on the public debt in gold, as it ought, it will take somewhat over 4 millions a month, beside payments for the sinking fund and for called bonds, and besides payments and beside keeping the reserve for the redemption of the greenbacks. If there is no financial alarm, and no export demand for gold, the sale of bonds of 20 to 40 millions might, as many think, maintain the gold basis for all the government payments, and lose 2 millions a month through the rest of the year. That is to say, it would make good deterioration in the financial condition of the government consequent upon paying 2 millions a month for silver bullion. If the government should be compelled to use silver in its payments, it would have to be considered whether it should not pay the interest on the bonds, the sinking fund, and the called bonds in gold, and maintain the gold fund for the redemption of greenbacks, and use the silver in common with such surplus of gold as may remain, in the payment of the other expenditures of the government. This would perfectly protect the public honor and faith, but you might have some clamor against two currencies. It could scarcely be said that made one currency for the government and another for the people, because the greenbacks are really the people's currency. I write in great haste, because there is no time, and can but make imperfect suggestions. Mr. Jordan has submitted this morning 4 statements, of which I send one, as containing some suggestions of detail which might be useful. Yours truly, S.J.T. The financial crisis of 1883, which compelled an extra session of Congress, and the repeal of the law requiring large monthly purchases of silver by the Treasury, lend a special interest to the following prescient letter to Mr. Manning. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 14, 1885. Dear Mr. Manning, I enclose a small pamphlet written by Mr. Coe. His theory is to depend upon the policy of not calling in any bonds, as a means for carrying the additional quantity of silver which the law compels you to buy, until sometime after the next session of Congress to suspend the silver purchases. If the making or withholding of calls is in the discretion of the Secretary, which I am inclined to think it is, having as yet found no compulsory mandate, I think it will be highly inexpedient to exhaust the Treasury, if you mean to continue all the gold payments on the gold basis. Mr. Jordan has sent me a series of statements which show that about $33 million of the gold fund reserved for the redemption of the legal tenders have been consumed in the ordinary payments of the Treasury. According to the construction adopted by your predecessors, untied states 4% bonds can lawfully be sold to make good that deficiency. Mr. Jordan's figures cover some other topics. Having partially examined them, I have given them to Mr. Marble for a few days, as he can verify the references to the authorities more conveniently than I can. I think that between these two resources you can tide yourself along until the opportunity arises to make the issue in Congress, without resorting to any silver payments. I expect to write to you again within a few days. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Honorable Daniel Manning, Secretary of the Treasury. Mr. Jordan, to whom the following letter was addressed, had been selected by Mr. Manning for the position of Treasurer of the United States. It is quoted here partly for its intrinsic value and partly to show the active interest which Mr. Tilden took in the administration of the national finances at a time when the roar of the breakers towards which the ship of state was drifting seemed more audible at Greystone than elsewhere. Tilden to Jordan. Confidential. Greystone, Yonker, New York, May 15, 1885. Dear Mr. Jordan, the memorandum for the solution of the silver question enclosed in your letter appears to me to have elements from which to devise a measure. It would need some modification and require to be perfected. The law will put the proposition in more definite shape and will be a better basis to act on than so brief and general a proposition. When General Warner shall have written it out, please send me a copy. The advantage of bringing up the coin in fineness and weight to the market value of the silver it contains is very great. It would widen the market for silver and so benefit the producers. It should apply to the half and quarter dollars. Can you inform me what percent the cost of coinage is on the dollar? Also on the halves and quarters taken together? You will remember that when it was proposed to resume specie payment, nearly everybody thought that the preliminary step was to contract the currency. I maintained the opposite views. I said that nobody could tell how much currency the wants of business would require, that to assume an arbitrary amount was the height of quackery, that the only true way was to leave that matter to adjust itself under a free system. I apply the same principle to silver. I am willing to take all that the business of the country can absorb, it is impossible to do anything more. To force the quantity of the currency above its natural level is as idle an attempt as was Dame Partington's effort with her mop to keep back the Atlantic Ocean. The measure should be carefully guarded to avoid any such folly. It would be necessary to invest the Treasury with a discretion which would enable it to follow and not to force nature. It will give me pleasure to see General Warner at Greystone. I know him very well and think well of him. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Application having been made to Mr. Tilden for his views of a draft of some resolutions designed to be presented for the adoption of the State Convention of the Democratic Party of New York State in the fall of 1885, he sent the following reply. Section 6, relating to the silver question, is well enough in substance. Section 1, relating to the civil service, is free from objections. Section 2, is right and well expressed. Section 3, proposing a repeal of certain laws of 1869 relating to the tenure of office. That is right. It restores to the President his power of appointment, which by those laws has been in part usurped by the Senate. But a question arises as to the expediency of making this declaration at the present time. That question will be considered in connection with Section 4. Section 4 proposes a repeal of the laws of May 15, 1820, which fixes the term of 4 years to a large number of important offices. Without deciding the question whether if that stood alone the extinction of fixed terms for these offices is expedient, which is not free from doubt, in practice at the present time the proposition involves insurmountable mischiefs. The Senate will not consent to a repeal of the laws of 1867 and 1869. The Senate will be glad to obtain the repeal of the law of May 15, 1820. If the President and the House of Representatives make a Democratic Party question in favor of repealing the law of May 15, 1820, the measure will be passed. The practical effect will be to put all the offices which now have fixed tenures under the laws of 1867 and 1869. That result would strip the President of the only independent power of appointment which he now has, and place him completely under the tutelage of the Senate. It would sweep away from the Democrats any chance of obtaining any participation in the government of the country. If a declaration in favor of repealing the laws of 1867 and 1869, which declaration will be wholly nugatory and useless, involves also the declaration in favor of the repeal of the law of May 15, 1820, which would be effectual, both ought to be omitted. The repeal of the law of May 15, 1820, even if proper, as part of the system in which the repeal of the laws of 1867 and 1869 should be also a part, it should never be done separately or in advance. The effect on the Democratic Party of such a piece of democratic insanity it is easy to foresee. It probably would be a collapse of the Democratic Party, and of the present Democratic administration. On the whole, in my judgment sections 3 and 4 are too abstruse, and involve topics which not one man in 50 in the convention will have any knowledge of. They are unfit for planks in the platform. They had better be omitted, even apart from the objection above stated. Section 5. The authority of Washington, cited in this section, involves a doubt. Washington language seems to imply that all office holders should be in political accord with the President. That means a clean sweep. That greatly exceeded the claim of Mr. Jefferson for his party. He only asked that they should have a fair participation in the public trusts of the country. He said, when he came into the presidency, if he had found the Democrats in possession of even a moderate share, he would have waited for time and circumstances to have remedied the injustice, but, having found a complete monopoly of the offices in the hands of the minority, who had been discarded by the people, he was compelled to apply a prompter corrective. You can study Mr. Jefferson's principles and views of this subject with great advantage. In March of the year in which this criticism was dispatched to Mr. Manning, Mr. Tilden made a careful analysis of President Jefferson's views of the tenure of office of the civil officers of the federal government, with a commentary thereon which reflected his own views, and the principles upon which, if clothed with the responsibilities of a chief magistrate, he would have endeavored to regulate that service. It will be found to illustrate the difference in the ways this problem is dealt with by statesmen and by cranks. Jefferson and the Civil Service. Thomas Jefferson was one of the greatest reformers that this country has produced, perhaps the greatest. When he became president, the country was first divided politically according to the two fundamental interpretations of the Constitution, the Federalist and the Democratic. Under the presidency of John Adams, as it had been previously under Washington, the tendency of the administration was strongly toward the establishment of an overmastering federal government, and the whole government machinery was solidly organized in the harmony with that tendency. None but Federalists were in office. The Federalist idea had gained a great hold upon the people. If such weapons as the Alien and Sedition laws had not been furnished to the Democrats by the administration, it is scarcely possible that they could have beaten their opponents, and, instead of the establishment of the democracy in power at that time, the Federalists might have retained their control of the country, and so strengthened it that the complexion of our politics might now have been materially different, and perhaps lacking in some features that we today regard as essential to republicanism. It was Jefferson's mission to arrest the inclination toward a more highly centralized system of federal control, and formally to lay the foundation on which our democracy has rested since his time, and must continue to rest so long as the democratic idea shall endure. Upon Jefferson's accession to office, he found all national posts filled by members of the federal party. Men of democratic views of politics had been entirely proscribed. There was scarcely a Republican, so the Democrats were then called, enjoying a place of honor or trust under the government. In short, the party that had just carried the election and demonstrated its supremacy among the people had absolutely no participation whatsoever in the government beyond its representations on the national ticket and its members of Congress. The votes of the majority had changed the elective officers only. That was all they could change. What remained to be done in order to carry out their wishes was to be done by the executive. To do this, to correct the existing abuses, and to restore a political equilibrium, was regarded by the new president as kindred in importance to the firm establishment of democratic principles. Indeed, such a reform was implied and rendered necessary by those principles, not only for the sake of a more equal and democratic distribution of responsibility, but because the spirit of democracy is opposed to the endless continuation of one party in power, and to the institution of a class of bureaucrats. Notwithstanding the immensity of labor, and in spite of vigorous remonstrances from the Federalist, as well as the feeble and petulant protests of impartial idlers who were remote from politics, and whose souls revolted at any form of upheaval or of progress, Mr. Jefferson began his task and carried it to a successful completion. But it was not done without appreciation of the disadvantages and imperfections attached to the work. An occasion for the expression of Mr. Jefferson's views upon the subject of official changes, and of the principles and motives under which he exercised the power conferred upon him for making them, came but a few months after his inauguration. It was brought about by a protest of Elias Shipman and others, a committee of the merchants of New Haven, against 2 appointments of the President, and his views on the subject are explained in the following letter. Washington, July 12, 1801. Gentlemen, I have received the remonstrance you were pleased to address to me on the appointment of Samuel Bishop to the office of Collector of New Haven, lately vacated by the deal of David Austin. The right of our fellow citizens to represent to the public functionaries their opinion on proceedings interesting to them is unquestionably a constitutional right, often useful, sometimes necessary, and will always be respectfully acknowledged by me. Of the various executive duties, no one excites more anxious concern than that of placing the interests of 4 fellow citizens in the hands of honest men, with understanding sufficient for their stations. No duty at the same time is more difficult to fulfill. The knowledge of character possessed by a single individual is, of necessity, limited. To seek out the best through the whole Union, we must resort to other information, which, from the best of men, acting disinterestedly and with the purest of motives, is sometimes incorrect. In the case of Samuel Bishop, however, the subject of your remonstrance, time was taken, information was sought, and such obtained as could leave no room for doubt of his fitness. From private sources it was learned that his understanding was sound, his integrity pure, his character unstained. And the offices confided to him within his own state are public evidence of the estimation in which he is held by the state in general and the city and township particularly in which he lives. He is said to be the town clerk, a justice of the peace, mayor of the city of New Haven, an office held at the will of the legislature, chief judge of the Court of Common Pleas for New Haven County, a court of high criminal and civil jurisdiction, wherein most causes are decided without the right of appeal or review, and sole judge of the Court of Probates, wherein he singly decided all questions of wills, settlement of estates, testate and intestate, appoints guardians, settles their accounts, and, in fact, has under his jurisdiction and care all the property, real and personal, of persons dying. The 2 last offices in the annual gift of the legislature were given to him in May last. It is possible that the man to whom the legislature of Connecticut has so recently committed trusts of such difficulty and magnitude is unfit to be the collector of the district of New Haven, though acknowledged in the same writing to have obtained all this confidence, by long life of usefulness. It is objected, indeed, in the remonstrance, that he is 77 years of age, but at a much more advanced age our Franklin was the ornament of human nature. He may not be able to perform in person all the details of his office, but if he gives us the benefit of his understanding, his integrity, his watchfulness, and takes care that all the details are well performed by himself or his necessary assistants, all public purposes will be answered. The remonstrance, indeed, does not allege that the office has been poorly conducted, but only apprehends that it will be so. Should this happen, in an event, be assured I will do in it what shall be just and necessary for the public service. In the meantime, he should be tried without being prejudged. The removal, as it is called, of Mr. Goodrich forms another subject of complaint. Declarations by myself in favor of political tolerance, exhortations to harmony and affection in social intercourse, and to respect for the equal rights of the minority, have, on certain occasions, been quoted and misconstrued into assurances that the tenure of offices was to be undisturbed. But could candor apply to such a construction? It is not, indeed, in the remonstrance that we find it, but it leads to the explanation which that calls for. When it is considered that during the late administration those who were not of a political sect of politics were excluded from all office, when, by a steady pursuit of this measure, nearly the whole offices of the United States were monopolized by that sect, when the public sentiment at length declared itself, and burst open the doors of honor and confidence to those whose opinions they more approved, was it to be imagined that this monopoly of office was still to be continued in the hands of the minority? Does it violate their equal rights to assert some rights in the majority also? Is it political intolerance to claim a proportionate share in the direction of public affairs? Can they not harmonize in society unless they have everything in their own hands? If the will of the nation, manifested by their various elections, calls for an administration of government according with the opinions of those elected, if, for the fulfillment of that will, displacements are necessary, with whom can they so justly begin as with persons appointed in the last moments of an administration, not for its own aid, but to begin a career at the same time with their successors, by whom they had never been approved, and who could scarcely expect from them a cordial cooperation? Mr. Goodrich was one of these. Was it proper for him to place himself in office without knowing whether those whose agent he was to be would have confidence in his agency? Can the preference of another as the successor to Mr. Austin be candidly called a removal of Mr. Goodrich? If a due participation of office is a matter of right, how are vacancies to be obtained? Those by death are few, by resignation, none. Can any other mode than that of removal be proposed? This is a painful office, but it is made my duty, and I meet it as such. I proceed in the operation with deliberation and inquiry, that it may injure the best men least, and effect the purposes of justice and public utility with the least private distress, that it may be thrown, as much as possible, on delinquency, on oppression, on intolerance, on anti-revolutionary adherence to our enemies. The remonstrance laments that a change in administration must produce a change in the subordinate officers, in other words, that it should be deemed necessary for all officers to think with their principal. But on whom does this imputation bear? On those who have excluded from the office every shade of opinion which was not theirs? Or on those who have been so excluded? I lament sincerely that unessential differences of opinion should ever have been deemed sufficient to interdict half the society from the rights and the blessings of self-government, to proscribe them as unworthy of every trust. It would have been to me a circumstance of great relief had I found a moderate participation of office in the hands of the majority. I would gladly have left to time and accident to raise them to their just share. But their total exclusion calls for prompter corrections. I shall correct the procedure, but that done, return with joy to that state of things when the only questions concerning a candidate shall be, is he honest? Is he capable? Is he faithful to the Constitution? I tender you the homage of my high respect. Thomas Jefferson. This was not all of Mr. Jefferson's correspondence on this matter. On August 26, a little more than 1 month after the letter to the New Haven merchants, the President wrote as follows from Monticello to Mr. Levi Lincoln, of Massachusetts, the Attorney General in his cabinet. Dear Sir, I am glad to learn from you that the answer to New Haven had a good effect in Massachusetts on the Republicans, and no ill effects on the sincere Federalists. I had foreseen, years ago, that the first Republican president who should come into office after all the places in the government had become exclusively occupied by Federalists, would have a dreadful operation to perform. That the Republicans would consent to a continuation of everything in federal hands was not to be expected, because neither just nor polite. On him, then, was to devolve the office of an executioner, that of lopping off I cannot say that it has worked harder than I expected. You know the moderations of our views in this business, and that we all concurred in them. We determined to proceed with deliberation. This produced impatience in the Republicans, and a belief we meant to do nothing. Some occasion of public explanation was eagerly desired, when the New Haven remonstrance offered up that occasion. The answer was meant as an explanation to our friends. It has had on them, everywhere, the most wholesome effect. Appearances of schismatizing from us have been entirely done away. It will be particularly interesting to those who now expect changes in offices with anxiety, to read such high testimony as that of Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Lincoln, that such changes can be accomplished with benefit to the public service and with the acquiescence of such of the withdrawing party as have a right to be heard in the political world, those who take part in its contest, and understand its obligations. The action of Mr. Jefferson in these instances had a good effect on the Republicans, and no ill effects on the sincere Federalists. But a third letter from the President to Mr. Lincoln, dated at Washington on October 25, 1802, gives a still clearer education of the ideas which guided him in his administration, with some additional comments, which are peculiarly pertinent to the situation of today. Dear Sir, I still think our original idea as to office is best. This is to depend, for the obtaining a just participation, on deaths, resignations and delinquencies. This will least affect the tranquillity of the people, and prevent their giving in to the suggestions of our enemies, that ours had been a contest for office, not for principle. This is rather a slow operation, but it's sure if we pursue it steadily, which however, has not been done with the undeviating resolution I could have wished. To these means of obtaining a just share in the transaction of the public business shall be added one other, to wit removal for electioneering activity, or open and industrious opposition to the principles of the present government, legislative and executive. Every officer of the government may vote at elections according to his conscience, but we should betray the cause committed to our care were we to permit the influence of official patronage to be used to overthrow that cause. Here, then, in these 3 short epistles of the founder of the democracy, is his theory upon which a party succeeding to the management of the national machinery after it has been under the hostile control of an uncompromising partisan organization, should address itself to the task of obliterating the most objectionable elements of partisan rule, and instituting in their stead a purer and more democratic system. But these arguments of Mr. Jefferson are concerned merely with the principle that when a party succeeds to the management of federal affairs, and finds the government functions wholly in the hands of its opponents, it has the right, and it is its duty, to establish it one power by turning its opponents out of office, even if for no other reason than that it wants to put its own adherents in their places. Other cases, where changes are confessedly necessary, are not referred to by Mr. Jefferson. Confidential offices, which powerfully affect the action of the chief executive, must be filled by persons in cordial harmony with the executive. Under any other supposition the election of a partisan president would be a farce, and government party would be impossible. Moreover, offices that have been filled in violation of modern civil service principles may be changed without violating those principles. So, also, offices conferred on the spoils system, without reference to the competency or fitness of the incumbents, are not required by civil service principles to remain with the abuses uncorrected. Besides, experience has shown that all trusts where the abuse is not restrained by the vigilant and firm supervision of the superior, directly interested in maintaining economy, there is a tendency to the useless multiplication of assistants. Every officer, after a little while, wants a waiter, and by that waiter himself wants a waiter. Everybody disputes his duties to a subordinate, and withdraws himself into a mere superintendence of the underling. Moreover, while subordinates are appointed to oblige members of Congress or other prominent persons, the whole drift is to a creation of more offices. The distension to which the public service had now grown from these and other causes is enormous and incredible. A glance at the Blue Book will amaze anyone who is not acquainted with that astonishing record. Removals may therefore be necessary, not only on the other grounds we have mentioned, but also for the purpose of promoting economy in the public service. The state of the government is now worse by many-fold, more in need of a change, more in need of regeneration, by retrenchment as well as by removals, than it was when the democracy began its career in 1801. The defeated party retires after a term of power twice as long as that which the Federalists had enjoyed when they were overthrown. The perversion of the government from the standard to which government in this country should conform is proportionately far greater than it had been when Mr. Jefferson's administration began. By just so much is the present work of reform more arduous and its necessity more imperative. Thus the principles enunciated by President Jefferson 84 years ago are as true today as they were then, and they will operate as beneficially now as they did when first brought into practice by that great democratic statesman. In the following letter we have an opportunity of seeing something of the directions in which he helped to shape Mr. Manning's first report to Congress. Tilden to Manning, Confidential. November 14, 1885. Dear Mr. Manning, I have been so much troubled by a derangement of my digestion that I could not find an opportunity to put in shape suggestions for you. But yesterday, having noticed from Mr. Marble that he would call in the afternoon for consultation, I dictated, notwithstanding the suffering I was undergoing, the paper which I now send. I notice that you make the surplus for the present year to be $70 million. Mr. Jordan told me a few days ago it would not exceed $40 million, of which $24 million would be consumed by purchasers of silver, leaving only $16 million of real surplus. I ought to know the true amount. In my judgment, the passage of the harbor defenses ought to precede all other discussions about the surplus revenue. What Mr. Marble is preparing relates to the silver question. If anything is said about revenue reform or the tariff, that topic should come third. I incline to doubt whether you can discuss the latter topic with any advantage. Certainly you cannot submit a specific plan in your annual report. The subject is too complicated and extensive to be disposed of incidentally in the general finance report. I am clear that the discussion about harbor defense properly belongs to your department. The reason is stated in the beginning of the paper I send you. No doubt either the War of the Navy Department would be glad to occupy that ground. But not to them, but to you alone, belong the general survey of the financial policy of the government. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. The defense of our sea coast, to which allusions are made in the foregoing paper, had been occupying no inconsiderable portion of Mr. Tilden's thought and study during the greater part of the year 1885, and he was anxious that the subject should be pressed upon the attention of Congress and of the country with all the authority of a new administration. Having no encouragement to submit his opinions upon this or any other subject to the President directly, and anxious to give Mr. Manning something for his report calculated, as he correctly believed, to produce upon the country a favorable impression of their new and inexperienced Minister of Finance, Mr. Tilden sent him a letter setting forth in a general way the results of his reflections upon the subject of harbor defenses. In due time he received from the Secretary the following humiliating reply, humiliating to Mr. Tilden only because it disclosed a situation so humiliating to Mr. Manning. Manning to Tilden. Washington, D.C., December 1, 1885. My dear Governor, I find that I cannot do what I wish to do with the Seacoast Defenses paper, and I am in great distress about it. I had intended to begin my first report with that paper, but I am now reluctantly forced to the conclusion that it will be impracticable. My report has not been read or discussed by any of the people here, but during the past few days I have been called upon to listen to several public documents, and the conclusion I have been driven to is, that if I were to submit my report, as I must, sooner or later, to like reading and criticism, with the Seacoast Defenses, paragraphs therein could not be retained. I am certain that if I were to publish the report without conference with any one, it would immediately and seriously embroil my personal relations in 2 or 3 cases. Moreover, as I now know what recommendations are to be made, should put myself in a most invidious position. Such publication would be fatal to carrying through the plan. If there is no publication, I can be of much service in pressing forward the policy so powerfully recommended in the paper, and I judge that you will prefer that to any form of stating it. I have arrived at this decision after deliberate thought, and I regret that I cannot give you my reasons more fully, but I have talked them over with Mr. Marble, and I hope to hear, after he has explained the case to you in all its bearings, that you approve my judgment. Anxiously hoping that this may not carry disappointment, I am sincerely your friend, Daniel Manning. By return mail Mr. Manning received the following reply from Mr. Tilden, Tilden to Manning. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, December 3, 1885. Dear Mr. Manning, you need not concern yourself for the omission to use the discussion on our seacoast defenses which I sent you. My purpose was to advance a public object, and to help you to take a position not only wise and patriotic, but embracing many elements of public satisfaction and popularity. If it would excite the jealousy of any one of your colleagues, or be regarded by them as trenching upon their peculiar domain, although I should not agree that they would have any cause for discontent, it may be best to sacrifice something to appease them. No explanation to me is necessary. Perhaps, to save the waste of a morning's dictation at a time when I was not fit to work, I may think it expedient to use the material some other way. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. It had by this time become manifest to Mr. Tilden, not only that he was not a persona grata to the President, which he more than suspected before, but that it was anything but a recommendation in the President's eyes to be a friend of his. It was no doubt a conviction of this sort which impelled Mr. Tilden to address a copy of his rejected views about seacoast defenses in the following letter to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, by whom it was immediately given to the press. Tilden to Carlisle. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, December 1, 1885. Dear Mr. Carlisle, as public opinion point to you as the Speaker of the House of Representatives, I desire to submit a suggestion as to one of the public objects for which an appropriation ought to be prompt and liberal. In considering the state and management of the public revenues, the subject involves the questions whether we shall extinguish the surplus by reducing the revenue, or whether we shall apply the surplus to payments on the public debt, or whether we shall seize the occasion to provide for our seacoast defenses, which have been long neglected. I am of the opinion that the latter is a paramount necessity which ought to precede the reduction of the revenue, and ought also to precede an excessive rapidity in the payment of the public debt. The property exposed to destruction in the 12 seaports, Portland, Portsmouth, Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Galveston, and San Francisco, cannot be less in value than $5,000 million. To this must be added a vast amount of property dependent for its use on these seaports. Nor does this statement afford a true measure of the damage which might be caused to the property and business of the country by a failure to protect these seaports from hostile naval attacks. They are the centers, not only of foreign commerce, but of most of the internal trade and exchanges of domestic productions. To this state of things the machinery of transportation of the whole country has become adapted. The interruption of the currents of traffic by the occupation of one or more of our principal seaports by a foreign enemy, or the destruction of them by bombardment, or holding over them the menace of destruction for the purpose of exacting contribution or ransom, would inflict upon the property and business of the country an injury which can neither be foreseen nor measured. The elaborate and costly fortifications which were constructed with the greatest engineering skill, are now practically useless. They are not capable of resisting the attacks of modern artillery. A still greater defect exists in our coast defenses. The range of the best modern artillery has become so extended that our present fortifications, designed to protect the harbor of New York, where 2/3 of the import trade and more than 1/2 of the export trade of the whole United States is carried on, and are too near the great populations of New York City and Jersey City, and Brooklyn to be of any value as protection. To provide effectual defenses would be the work of years. It would take much time to construct permanent fortifications. A small provision of the best modern guns would take several years. Neither of these works can be extemporized in presence of emergent danger. 1,000,000 of soldiers, with the best equipments, on the heights surrounding the harbor of New York, in our present state of preparation, or rather in our total want of preparation, would be powerless to resist a small squadron of war steamers. This state of things is discreditable to our foresight and to our prudence. The best guarantee against aggression, the best assurance that our diplomacy will be successful and pacific, and that our rights and honor will be respected by other nations, is in their knowledge that we are in a situation to vindicate our reputation and interests. While we may afford to be deficient in the means of offense, we cannot afford to be defenseless. The notoriety of the fact that we have neglected the ordinary precautions of defense invites want consideration in our diplomacy, injustice, arrogance, and insult at the hand of nations. It is now more than 60 years since we announced to the world that we should resist any attempts, from whatever quarter they might come, to make any new colonizations on any part of the American continent, that while we should respect the status quo, we should protect the people of different nations inhabiting this continent from every attempt to subject them to the dominion of any European power, or to interfere with their undisturbed exercise of the rights of self-government. This announcement was formally made by President Monroe, after consultation with Mr. Madison and Mr. Jefferson. It was formulated by John Quincy Adams. Our government has firmly adhered to the Monroe Doctrine, and even so late as 1865 it warned Napoleon III out of Mexico. It is impossible to foresee, in the recent scramble of the European powers for acquisition of colonies, how soon an occasion may arise for our putting in practice the Monroe Doctrine. It is clear that there ought to be some relation between our assertion of that doctrine and our preparation to maintain it. It is not intended to recommend any attempt to rival the great European powers in the creation of a powerful navy. The changes which have rapidly occurred by the diminution of relative resisting power of the defensive armor of ironclads, and by the increased efficiency of modern artillery, which on a whole has gained in the competition, suggest we should not at present enter largely into the creation of armored vessels. In the questions that beset this subject until they have reached a solution, we can content ourselves with adding but sparingly to our navy. But what we do add should be the very best that science and experience can indicate. This prudential view is reinforced by the consideration that the annual charge of maintaining war vessel bears an important proportion to the original cost of construction. In constructing permanent fortifications, and in providing an ample supply of the best modern artillery, the annual cost of maintenance is inconsiderable. Nearly the whole expenditure is in the original outlay for construction. If we do not make the expenditure necessary to provide for our seacoast defenses when we have a surplus, and have no need to levy new taxes, we certainly will not make those expenditures when we have no longer a surplus in the treasury. To leave our vast interests defenseless in order to reduce the cost of whiskey to its consumers would be solecism. The present time is peculiarly favorable for providing for this great national necessity too long neglected. Not only does the surplus in the treasury supply ample means to meet this great public want without laying new burdens upon the people, but the work can now be done at a much lower cost than has ever before been possible. The defensive works would consist almost entirely of steel and iron. These materials can now be had at unprecedentedly low price. A vast supply of machinery and of labor called into existence by a great vicissitude in the steel and iron industries offers itself to our service. We should have the satisfaction of knowing that while we were availing ourselves of the supplies which would ordinarily be unattainable, we were setting in motion important industries and giving employment to labor in a period of depression. With encouragement by the guarantee of work, or perhaps by the government itself furnishing the plant, the inventive genius of our people would be applied to the creation of new means and improved machinery, and establishments would spring into existence capable of supplying all of the national wants, and rendering us completely independent of all other countries in respect to the means of national defense. I endeavor to impress these ideas upon Mr. Randall the last time I had the pleasure of seeing him. With my highest regards to Mrs. Carlisle and yourself, I remain, very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Honorable John G. Carlisle. The appearance of this communication a few days before the submission of the President's first annual message to Congress was regarded with anything but satisfaction at the White House. And all the less because the recommendations it contained received not only more attention from the public than any made by the President in his message. The liberal appropriations for our wooden walls during the succeeding 5 or 6 years were, I believe, in a large degree attributable to the impression left upon Congress and the country by this communication. When announcing Mr. Tilden's death, the New York World said, "Only 8 months ago today Mr. Tilden wrote his letter to Mr. Carlisle on the subject of coast defenses." The letter had more weight with the people than a presidential message. It was recognized as the thoughtful plea of a patriotic citizen and statesman for what he believed was for the safety and honor of the nation. Later still, less than 2 months ago, this impressive document was followed by a letter to Senator Hawley regretting the apathy of Congress on the subject, and stating that 700 papers from all parts of the country and representing all political parties had been sent to the writer endorsing his suggestions for strengthening our seacoast defenses. Mr. Tilden may be truly said to have died at the post of duty. Mr. Tilden's communication would probably not have appeared just when it did, had he not been willing to undeceive all who were under the impression that he was in any respect responsible for the acts or omissions of the President, and this had become important for his own peace, so general was the impression that his voice was potential at the White House. Illustration of Governor Tilden and Mayor Wickham opening the promenade at the Martha Washington reception. Academy of Music will be included in documentary. End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Please share, like and subscribe for production updates about Samuel Tilden series. Thank you.